My dear Divyavani viewers, welcome to this program, The Word of God. The last couple of weeks I shared some thoughts with you regarding the missionary journey of St. Paul and the journey St. Thomas made to bring God's news, good news to India. I shared some thoughts with you about the way he worked in India, hardly 20 years, but then he established at least seven communities and made them self-sufficient in such a way that they would continue. From today, I would like to share some thoughts with you from the book of Exodus. This is not going to be like a scripture class with all the details. The intention that I have in my mind is to strengthen your faith. To strengthen our faith, because the Israelites, they received their faith through those events that were connected with the Exodus. That was their faith experience through which they became a chosen nation, a nation that dedicated its life, despite all the difficulties and problems, dedicated themselves to God. Sometimes they obeyed God, sometimes they disobeyed God, but then all that was a various type of experience. On the one hand, success, on the other hand, failure, but all the time God was with them and they continued to make their journey with God, Yahweh. The Exodus itself, what it means is going out of Egypt. It was at the very heart of Israel's faith experience. It was at the heart of their faith experience because on the one hand, God who acted on Israel's behalf was not an insignificant deity of the ancient Near East. It was not cut off from reality. God was so close to the Israelites and he acted in reality, in time, did not relegate all that to the realm of mythical time. Through such intimate relationship between Yahweh and Israel, the faith experience that the Israelites got was something that was so significant. It was so distinct from any other God, any other people's gods and belief and religion, that it was really unique for Israel. Israel's God, in a way, dramatically entered the arena of real time and real people. God entered into their lives, and as the introduction to the Decalogue, that is in Exodus chapter 20 verse 2, God says, I, the Lord, am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that place of slavery. In other words, God emphatically established that it is He who brought them out of Egypt. And from that time onwards, He said, you will be my people. I will be your God. This He repeated a number of times. And it was that relationship that Yahweh established with the people of Israel. Whenever they would mention Yahweh, a whole lot of series of incidents would really come up in their thoughts, and they can imagine all that happened from the very first appearance of Yahweh through Moses to the people, and all the plagues that inflicted on the Pharaoh and the Egyptians, how the Israelites would move out of that slavery and all that. In order to deepen our faith, and that is the purpose of these talks, to deepen our faith, a deeper understanding of those events in the right historical situation will help us. And with that in mind, I will only explain a few things that are really important and crucial in their faith formation. The Exodus identifies not only Yahweh, who He is, who that God is, it also identifies Israel. Who is Israel? Who are the people of Israel? Little bit of a historical background I will give little later. But then, now itself, I would like you to think of Israel as emerging as God's own chosen people. And that was clearly established in all those activities, all those events. And all those events implied that the former Egyptian slaves were now different from all their contemporaries. Difference is that this is a historical event where God enters their lives and God changes their lives. That historical event made the Exodus something so unique, something that is so distinct from all other God experiences of all other people of that time. The Exodus with the covenant experience also made it something very distinct. The idea of a covenantal people, the idea of a covenantal God is also something unique. The covenant that God established on Mount Sinai, and that covenant was between Yahweh and the people of Israel. The people of Israel had to confess that they will obey the commandments God has given them, and that was concluded in a sacrifice, again, which in detail I will explain some other time. But that was a covenant concluded with a sacrifice between God, Yahweh, and the people of Israel. In that covenant, in Exodus chapter 24, where Moses actually takes the blood of the sacrificial lamb animal, half of it he pours on the altar, half he sprinkles on the people, showing that half on behalf of God, half on behalf of the people. And there they concluded the covenant, the agreement. The agreement is between Yahweh, God, and the people of Israel. Through that covenantal relationship between God and Israelites, it becomes something again unique. Perhaps no other people have that sort of a relationship. In Exodus chapter 3 verse 7, God said, "I will take you as my own people, and you shall have me as your God." That was the covenant. That was the agreement that God made with the people. And notice, it's not a covenant that people made with God. It's the covenant that God made with the people. It is the covenant initiated by God Himself, and that initiation by Yahweh was in these terms: "I will be your God, you will be my own people." He chose those people not because of their any special ability. He chose them actually gratuitously, despite all their weaknesses, despite the fact that they would many times even go against God's commandments. But still God chose them. Chose them and said, you will be my people, I will be your God. The Exodus, the book of Exodus, actually identifies the people of Israel in a two-dimensional identity. It's a twofold identity. The identity is like this: Yahweh taking Israel as his own people on the one hand, and Israel acknowledging God, Yahweh, as their God. So both are there, and that defines the identity of Israel. Who is Israel? A people chosen by God to be his chosen special people. And who is Israel? People who have acknowledged Yahweh as their God. That identity Israel kept up. That identity had such great significance. And it is that identity that made Israel such a chosen special people. We'll have a short break. We'll come back after a couple of minutes. Welcome back. I was sharing with you some thoughts about the Exodus as the faith experience of the Israelites, through which they became a chosen people, through which they became God's own people. And I emphasized the double dimension. On the one hand, God chose them. On the other, those people acknowledged God's role. And in that way, that community, that faith community, the Israelites, kept up this identity all through. Exodus itself was most remarkably a going out, and many will emphasize that aspect, that they left Egypt, they left the slavery, and they became a free people who would live in their own land, in their own way, following God's commandments. More than emphasizing the going out itself, I personally would emphasize it was not just a going out, it was a choice, a selection that Yahweh made. It was not just a going out, but a selection process. Yahweh selected these people out of so many other nations and selected them to be his own people. So it was true, it was a going out, but going out of their slavery, going out of their old life, and going into a new life chosen by God Yahweh. So it was a double process through which they become God's own people. Through this special event of the Exodus, the Israelites had that twofold identity, which I already explained a little while ago. On the one hand, they are chosen by God. On the other hand, they are people who acknowledge Yahweh as their God. The biblical roots of Exodus in a way define the identity of Israel as people rooted on the one hand in Egypt's slavery, strange, but in Egypt's slavery. On the other hand, we may always tend to consider their roots in the promised land. But the roots of Israel are not in the promised land but outside it. It starts with the slavery in Egypt and they are going out from there. That is where the origins begin of the Israelites as a community. There is an intimate relationship between God and the people. The book of Exodus is not just the record of their itineraries, their journeys. It's like their identity papers. Israelites' identity papers, which is a record of the human interaction and divine grace. Human interaction, because that's the way the Israelites responded to God. All the time it was not positive. There were also moments of negative interaction, but that is also part of it. And if we look at the whole event, on the one hand, we see a series of human successes and failures. We will see a series of divine assistance and divine forgiveness. The Israelites sinned. God asked them to live a particular way of life. Often they didn't. But the mercy of God, which was infinite, which allowed God to forgive them and again receive them back. So it was the interaction between God and Israelites, interaction between the divine mercy and forgiveness and the Israelites' sometimes failures. And that actually sums up the record of the Exodus. Before we go into the details of the events of the Exodus, I would like to also bring to your attention their previous history, the Israelites' history. We know very little, from Noah something, from Abraham something more, and then Abraham's children, but then centuries passed. And who were they? Even Abraham is called out of a group of people. And who were that group? What is their identity before God chose Abraham, before God did anything with these people? The Egyptian records have very little about those events of the Exodus. That is something that we can easily understand, because this is about Israel's faith experience. They were not writing a secular book of history, and if at all they were to write, their only interest would be to glorify Pharaoh and his greatness. Now, with all those events, especially during the Exodus, naturally there isn't much to glorify Pharaoh. With all the pestilence and all that, there is very little that can be shown as Pharaoh's greatness, especially Moses dealing with the handicapped leaders of Egypt, with the plagues and so on. And therefore, the history will be rather mild. And they have not written practically anything perhaps. Nothing has survived anyway. In other words, the secular history of Egypt regarding that part is practically silent. Those events were actually not glorifying Pharaoh, and therefore perhaps no one bothered to write that part of the history. Before that, what happened to these people? And before that, who were they? In the Egyptian records, there is a mention of a people called Apiru. And in some other books, especially the Eastern Semitic language called Akkadian, the same people are referred to as Habiru. Now keep these two names in mind. One is Apiru, the other one Habiru, both referring to the same people. And the word Hebrew must be something that derived from both of these. And the little description that is available really places these people, the Israelites, in the right historical background. These people, this Apiru or Habiru, whichever one name you want to give, both are for them, and these people are referred to as a displaced people who lost their homeland and who were nomads or semi-nomads and herders, looking after cattle. And it really fits the Israelites. They were almost semi-nomadic. They were displaced people. They had no homeland. From the time they entered Egypt, though they went on their own, they were not actually dragged into slavery, but they went on their own. Ultimately, what happened most likely is this. These people, this Apiru or Habiru, these people intermingled with the local people, and in that process perhaps they lost their homeland. And because they lost their homeland and their possessions, most likely they also lost their traditional occupation. They were herders. Perhaps there was no scope for it, and they began to work for others, and that is how they slowly became, in our terms, slaves. Slaves who work for other people. There is also mention about the Bedouin. Bedouins are actually nomadic Arab people of the desert. The Bedouins were described as often providing workforce for the Egyptian building campaigners, and that may be the reason how the Israelites slowly became slaves, and from that onwards their life changes. I will continue in the next talk about these people, the ancestors of the Israelites, who were called Apiru or Habiru, and slowly that became the word Hebrew.